This is Critical Nonsense, our high-low-brow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, Joey asks Aaron about whether the replication crisis impacts research beyond science, and Aaron asks Joey about childhood favorites and how they stick with us.
Woo!
It seems so out of context in this gaudy apartment, Joey. That was terrible, but this is still what I sound like, which is mostly terrible.
No, never. I mean, I would say that it's beginning to look a lot like Aaron, and that's my response. So,
which is extremely dashing,
Aww.
debonair.
Keep the birthday love coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Happy birthday!
Thanks. I'm gonna be celebrating it for the next year.
What is your current pop culture song default for birthdays?
Oh,
I feel like it was there was a minute where it's
Yes.
2 Chainz,
Yes.
or potentially Rihanna.
yes.
Then for a minute for me it switched to Happy Ratchet Birthday by Drake.
Yes.
It
reveals
but you
so
know,
much.
what's yours?
Oh, mine has been Selena Gomez's birthday for the past, 10 years almost. No, I think it's been 7 years
stick to the
that she's
classics,
had that top spot. Yeah,
If it works, it works.
exactly.
Jess is not here this week. That's why she's not getting an introduction. We could call her by special diminutives if we wanted, but I think she would want to be here for that.
I'd
so
agree.
We can refrain. Yeah.
And if you hear my recording quality, it's because I chose to record in a glass bottle or a paper bag, depending on what this actually will sound like. So I hope you enjoy this delightful audio quality that is my fault, not sound engineer Alex Contel's. I will tell you that much right now.
Yeah. Aaron is actually recording inside a paper bag on the deck of a ship trapped in a bottle. So
yes, it's very confusing.
yeah, context matters.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any housekeeping. We keep it clean.
Yeah, rate, review, subscribe. Thanks.
5 stars, 5 stars. Aaron,
Yes, Joey.
could we talk about science?
He blinded me with science. Yes, I'd love to.
We're usually coming in pretty excited about science, but let's, sometimes things need to be taken to task.
Yes.
And,
yes.
There is a phenomena in which we should be dragging science a little bit, or scientists, they're not special people. They're people too. Scientists are people too.
Yes. Bumper sticker.
Yeah. So the replication crisis, I think, is a phenomena that I guess I don't know how long it's been getting more attention, depending on what you read or where you're talking. I think it's gotten more attention within sort of the scientific community over the past 10 or so years. And
what is the
more,
replication crisis?
Yeah, we should get that more public attention for the past 3 or 4 years, let's say, in essays and things like that. But the replication crisis is a huge portion of psychological, sociological, economics, and medical research is that is making it into journals and sort of esteemed locations where traditionally if you made it into a journal, that meant that your work has been peer reviewed. It is sort of past some threshold where it should be taken seriously. It is sort of a significant marker that it is a phenomena that should be looked at and understood and further explored. But on the order of, in some cases, 50 or close to 50% of those studies that are in journal articles, at least within a range of fields, are when they're attempted to be replicated, where someone looks at the study, understands the methodology that someone went through, and tries to replicate that process to repeat the findings that study did, right? Essentially like revalidating a finding. They're not able to, right? The portion, the outcomes of that study are sort of thin or tenuous and often rely on, statistical significance, right? You're reaching a p-value, which basically means like a confidence that your findings are like replicable within like 5% or something is, me reaching back into the depths of my like hard science statistical classes that I was taking to sort of do a sense making version of statistics. Probably bad. If there is a scientist on the line right now, you can hang up. You can leave the chat. But the reason I've been thinking about this is because you have this arena where scientists are hyper focused on getting findings through a method, the scientific method that can be replicable, of understanding some sort of fundamental truth about people, about medicine, about economic systems, whatever it is. And that's like their whole thing. When we look at our world where we're working with companies to make changes in how the institutions work and changing, how a product is designed or built, the impact that it has on the world and how it exists in the world, we're very regularly conducting research, and companies are constantly conducting research to better understand things, like to land on some truth and try and make decisions based on that thing. And so my question for you is, how should we be viewing market research and user research and sort of business research in a world where social scientists are going through a replication crisis?
I love when we start off conversations in the lightest, least dense place.
Small stakes.
It's so good. And I mean, like, I am going to overtly dodge the question for a minute because on one hand, the question, there's such there's so many issues at hand just with what's undergirding this crisis at all. I think it comes with sort of like the celebrityification of information over the past 10, basically since social media. Everyone truly wants to get their take out first. And I think we can't ignore the fact that influences academia as well, and young scientists who recognize that they're in systems that are publish or perish. Then you also have just the difficulties of the academic career path, and like the need to make sure that you are getting new, validated, reasonable knowledge out there that can move the needle forward, and or move, I guess, the world forward, move knowledge forward and humanity forward. And there are it's no easy task. It takes a huge investment, and getting there is very, very expensive. Let's just put that piece in there. So
yeah, there are huge individual stakes, right?
Yes.
Like getting tenure, your pay, your future after you've made significant investments like you're suggesting to get to that point.
Exactly. And then you also have, and I think this is probably tangential, but like it's relevant. It's in the universe of this conversation, which is this sort of like, I don't know, disintegration or renewed critique of truth that is just like, we can't deny that the past 6 years plus, I mean, truly, it's been probably since the 80s, we've had a new questioning and an inquisitive relationship with what is or is not true. How do you verify anything? And as access to knowledge becomes more easy, how do you actually validate what is true versus what is simply being said the loudest? And all three of those factors are like the things that we have to wade in with our work every day, but definitely seem like they're a part of this phenomenon, right?
Yeah. I mean, clearly this is a thing. While we've been talking, I pulled up like what is the market size of like the research, like customer research industry, and it's saying, according to ibisworld.com, it's saying that the market in 2021 is $23.7 billion, right? Like this is a massive industry. I wouldn't consider us in that industry, but we're adjacent to it. We touch it at different points, right? We work with vendors who are helping us conduct research and things like that. And so knowing how big it is, inherently shows you that there is sort of like a self-perpetuation of the ideas. And for me, to your point about like what is truth and what is the intention of conducting any research and making a decision, I think, like on an individual basis, which I don't feel like is a unique perspective. I'm not saying it to be like, this is how I see the world and it is like an interesting thing. I just find it super important to be doing research to add context to the people that context of the people you're trying to serve in the process of designing something, building something, changing something for them, to make sure that you're making a positive impact and having your decisions and your approach and your strategies be informed by those that are going to be touched by whatever it is you're creating. Like on a sort of individual fundamental level, right? Like that idea of empathy, I think is really important. The question is, to the truth point you made, like, how do we view that as sort of a broader business community, or as a strategy community, or as a, like creative knowledge worker community, right? We can determine how we want to set the bounds. But I think like within corporations, there is this orientation towards doing research that you're trying to land a fundamental truth, that truth is a static thing, and you're looking for like replicability and validation as a means to sort of like cover your ass, right? Like corporations and academia share that in common. Like CYA is like a very big driving force. But the reality is the types of things that we're trying to understand in these studies are not like fundamental truths about human beings that are going to be static over time, right? Like I was joking with you when we were getting on the call, if you conducted a segmentation study as like a very simple example in 2019, like turns out a global pandemic is going to change people's perspectives, motivations, and attitudes about just about everything. And that is like no longer valid. And so that idea of like, do you view research as a means of informing a decision, or as like an attempt to find like a static proof that is enduring over time, like will really change the way that you approach it and approach decision making as a company, right?
That's so true. And I think for the most part, companies and folks that engage in research are very familiar with the sort of conviction gap, like where your sample size will never be big enough to make you 100%, without any shadow of the doubt, believe that it is true. Like there, right. And I should say, like, yes, there are some studies in which you will invest that much time, energy, and budget. But I would say that especially just given the way that business works, that happens almost an infinitesimal number of times, as opposed to the number of other times where we're actually gathering insight and input from consumers or the world around us to help inform that and to create a smaller gap between essentially what we know and have heard and have observed from a certain amount of research and the strategic leap that we have to make by making a decision. That gap will always exist. But what I think is really fascinating is this question of, do we generally miss the instantaneousness gap or the relevancy gap or the currency gap? Is probably
context.
A good way to put it.
Yeah.
Because like there is no way. I love how not love, that's not the word. It's fascinating to me how much that got thrown into the spotlight on a day-to-day when the pandemic hit. And there are some folks that I know who are working on studies that were, generation studies, for example, looking at millennials or Gen Z or boomers. Other folks I know who were simply just trying to do product research and understanding how consumers would use a new service or product as the pandemic is coming in. And so, great, we can still conduct this research because we can do it virtually. However, from a content perspective, from an intention perspective, how do we interpret these learnings if everything is on such shifting sands? And perhaps it just revealed the fact that those sands are always shifting and we've not been sensitive to it as we should be. But also, we should be really rethinking how we contextualize, how we interpret, and how we apply those learnings to any individual challenge that we're facing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the interesting things about some of the findings, and we'll share an article from Vox in the show notes that does a pretty good recap of some of, a consolidation of the recent years of this conversation and what people are starting to find as they're digging into why the replication crisis exists. And one of the interesting things is someone created a betting market and asked scientists, taking only peer-reviewed journals, right? So things that had already crossed this sort of hallowed threshold of scientific studies that had been published in highly reputable journals and things like that, and asked these scientists just to look at the journal article and predict which ones would be replicable. And it turns out that the scientists were extremely good at predicting the replicability of the studies based on sort of the tenuousness. And I think, what in the business world would probably be called the truthiness line, where you can sort of spin something to make it appear true, but it is an extremely tenuous finding that is still technically statistically significant, but you kind of know looking at it you're calling it, it's easy to call bullshit even if the finding technically meets all of the criteria that have been established as norms and standards. And what's even more interesting is that lay people are also can predict above chance the likelihood that a study can be replicable, even if they're not scientists or trained, just by reading and sort of probably using common sense and a modicum of logic and whatever are still better than chance at predicting the replicability. And I feel that is a thing that we experience sometimes when you're coming into a new organization and there is some thing that has been determined as this is the way that we're going to this piece of research, this finding, this thing that exists is now how we have to operate as if it is true, even if the people in the organization are I don't think this really works, but we've made the decision that we're going to treat this like it's real. And in some of these studies, what they found is those journals that are easy, those journal articles or findings and studies that are easy to predict are not replicable, are cited and spread just as often as the articles that are highly replicable. And so, when within institutions, you find that these things exist because of both, I think, hygiene of the way that we're sort of creating studies, the capital we, everybody is creating studies, but also sort of how we're interpreting them and our philosophy around them, right? If you spend a lot of money to conduct some, massive multi-million-dollar global segmentation study with I don't know, Bain or something like that, and that is we invested this much. It is now the truth, and we are going to operate this is the truth until we decide that we're going to conduct a new version of it. And how do you start to analyze those things or make decisions with those things in context about like what are the more static aspects of a person, right? Like your attitudes about like what chocolate you like or something like that feels like an incredible amount of variance and probably not a static aspect of someone's personality, but your values, your sort of worldview feels like something that is like a more static thing. And so choosing where in which you look at these things and how you're sort of developing the hygiene of a study or what you're basing your decisions on. And not to say like, what is people's chocolate preference as an example I'm like pulling out of nowhere. Like it's worth understanding that if you're trying to design a new chocolate, but making a call and saying like that's a static thing that will exist in perpetuity and is like you found some fundamental scientific truth about like the human taste for chocolate is like that's not a thing that should exist. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Absolutely. I mean, there's two big things that jump out to me. One is this sort of importance of ethics, responsibility, and rigor in research. Like if we think about it, there is a need to establish what the truth is, to figure out how to talk about it with others, and then to amplify it and make sure that people hear it. And at the beginning of that funnel requires somebody who has ideally good intent, at the very least, an appreciation and an orientation toward truth above all else, rather than those other amplification and sort of articulation stages that it's going to have to go through. Because ultimately, if we're not staying true to that, then I think that those other steps get even more are more likely to convolute that truth and be bent. But the other thing that points out, or that this comes to or brings to mind for me, is the difference between academia and business, where academia should be wholly invested in the truth, even though we know that it is not. It is an industry in and of itself, but that should be its orientation. Whereas business is going to be oriented toward action. And therefore, it's really fascinating to me how I love that truthiness line that you're talking about. Like when you get to that point, it's so necessary in many ways, because there will never be enough information to get to that truth, nor does the business need to get to that truth. The business needs inspiration in order to steer in the proper direction toward their goals. And I think that like reality is something that is always going to be the sort of huge chasm between academic research and business research, but it's also going to be the thing that will always need to be evaluated within research that's being done for institutions. Because ultimately, the question of to what end is and should be the central question. It almost doesn't, not that the truth doesn't matter or that it doesn't matter what the truth is, but how you apply it is more important and says more about your character, your business performance, your future like richness than what that truth is.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of like brings up like a question, right? Like when there are many times in which it is a good decision to like go out and conduct research, right? And on like a broad swath of like narrow to very like general questions. But then the sort of response to those types of things is in looking at a methodology or looking at how a study is created and what types of questions it's asking and all of that is like where, why, and how am I generalizing this finding?
Yes.
Right? Because I think there is an incentive within that $23.7 billion industry to always be producing some sort of significant new thing, regardless of how a study is created or what is actually heard. There is an onus on a company conducting research to present information as though it is like a significant net new means of understanding the world or the question at hand, because the incentives exist in which that's the way that people are feeding themselves. And so that question that you have to put back on yourself if you work in an institution and you're viewing research is like, when, where, and how am I generalizing this information based on what was actually created, which maybe is like unfair, right? Maybe that means that it is putting a burden of understanding research on everybody that doesn't have the experience or the means to be able to do that. But at the same time, like right now, what happens is research often gets divided in an organization into like an insights team or something like that, where they're like the arbiters of the truth and like generalizability of things, or there's sort of like a shadow that exists, or like purposeful ignorance. Ignorance is too far, but like the idea of like, I don't work on that team, I don't need to know how they did it, I just need to understand what they tell me and then apply those things. So maybe I'm going like too systemically at this thing. You tell me.
It's Game of Thrones. I mean, it's been years since I read the books and then had my heart broken in that last season, because what was that? But when, this is going to be terrible, when what's-his-face becomes a part of the library and the magistrate, wow, it's shocking to me how quickly I was obsessed with that, and I no longer remember character names or the names of the library. Well, actually, as a result, I will generalize to this trope that is usually in fantasy and
Sam?
whatnot.
Are you talking about Sam?
I'm talking about Sam, and in my mind, I always am like, his name can't be Sam because Samwise was in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
You're mixing up Sams, and I'm not Tolkien.
He becomes a maester. Right?
Maester. See, Joey, this is why I like you. You fill my brain. You fill all the places in my brain that need filling. But basically, like so many, I think that a lot of times these sort of fantasy novels and stories dramatize the fact that there is sort of like somebody who's responsible for the money, there's somebody who's responsible for the truth, there's somebody who's responsible for power, and all of those different centers are totally disconnected and unfortunately intermingled. Like there's nefarious actors that are always trying to bring all of those three items and more in line with each other. But the reason I bring it up is because, of course, that's being done for a narrative foil in most cases, to highlight the fact that we don't prioritize as a culture distributing that knowledge and making that that sort of knowledge capture and treasuring a communal ideal. We have to prioritize one group to be responsible for it. And
yeah,
it makes sense. Like if we were in a society where everyone were simply a learner, well, it wouldn't be the type of society that produces things, which is just not how we are structured. And so I think that we definitely, in addition, continue to raise this question of what do we, not to make it too macro, but what do we care about education? Why, in the US in particular, do we continue to not actually invest as much money as humanly possible into education in order to help these, this sort of critical thinking become endemic and a part of our society, like at scale? And all of that ends up leading into these questions that come up in academia and in institutions. So I don't know. I'm there with you. I think the world is crap. That's basically where I am.
Yeah. Like a closing thought, I guess, because we've been talking about this for a minute, but, I think there's often a fear in, criticism, and certainly among, let's put scare quotes up, of like the intellectual class, of criticizing sort of institutions of knowledge for fear of like stoking an anti-intellectual thread in society or organizations, or sort of like igniting like an overcorrection on problems that you identify, right? And so I think it's like important to be able to have these discussions to say like, not that, we should not be doing research in the world, or, like I don't even have a formalized opinion on like whether or not the research industry should be $23.7 billion. Like it's less about that or, you know, like why is academia producing this sort of phenomena of the replication crisis and how do you do it? But I think it's important to then to be able to talk about that thing while saying like, we do still need scientists. We do still need people asking these questions, but, you know, forcing ourselves to get better at the ways in which we're internalizing knowledge, you know, and for us at least, it leans more in that sort of market, customer, user realm of research. But, you know, how do you build a philosophy that is able to be enduring, like a set of values that like knowledge is empowering, while also being able to then say like, can you be critical of the processes we're taking in order to sort of enable progress and reduce sort of the issues that arise, you know, as a byproduct of our current philosophies around it? I don't know.
So Joey, without a jest to steer us, how would you
Oh no.
wrap up this corner?
Oh, my Lanta. Why don't we go back to tropes? I think sort of the output of this for me is that there is a tendency, certainly among highly educated people, to deify data.
Like that.
To sort of like elevate it to this place that by simply having data, we're able to prove a point and sort of hold it in a regard that is extremely high, and the existence of data in and of itself proves a point. And I think what we need to be doing is presenting a more sort of intentional and critical view of both the ways in which we're collecting data as a result of research and designing studies, and also in the ways in which we apply it afterwards, understanding that most research that's conducted in the world is directional and informative and not tapping into sort of some fundamental truth. But, you know, the way that I always think about it is like, data is not the truth. Data is the detritus that the truth leaves behind. And so it can be informative, but it is not the answer. So that is my wrap-up corner. Sorry, Jess.
Don't deify data. It is the detritus. That's really nice. That's really good.
Yeah, that's it. Triple D. Just remind yourself, triple D.
Triple D.
Please, sir, I want some more. Aaron, can you fill some porridge into my mind ball?
I don't even know what to say about that. That makes me slightly ill, but you know, let's see what I can do. Let me see if I've got the
You're
oats.
more of a gruel. You've always been more of a gruel guy.
Yeah, 100%.
Not porridge.
100%. So, I've been, you know, Joey and you and I were talking a little bit before we got on here about like, what is there to talk about? Which is a terrible way to start a conversation right before we're recording a podcast. But
partially because we were like going extra heavy on everything that we were discussing.
Yes. And so honestly, and 100% honesty, as I'm talking to you, I was thinking about Emerson. And, you know, I've been talking to my parents about my niece and nephew a lot. And so it just took me back to childhood in general. And for some reason, lately, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about those truths that we held as children that we then sort of believed are our defining attributes as adults. And one of them for me, for example, was that as a kid, everyone knew 3 things about me. My favorite color was orange. I love pizza, pepperoni pizza above all else. And I'm terrified of dogs. If I come over to your house for a sleepover and you have a dog, the dog needs to be like, I need to not know that a dog was ever here, because I am going to like ruin the sleepover by scream crying and running through your house for hours. So in any case, things have changed. And some stayed the same. I love blue is my favorite color. I love pepperoni pizza. I had it for dinner last night. And I love dogs. I've got Rufio. Like I'm crazy about dogs. So in any case, it has brought me back to a very, very simple question. What do our childhood favorites reveal about us today as adults?
It's interesting to me thinking about this favorites conversation because both I do and see others do this thing, right? Like I have an almost 3-year-old, so people will see her that haven't seen her in a while, or like try to strike up a conversation with her and be like, "What's your favorite color? What's your favorite food?" Like it just comes up constantly. Like it does seem like the equivalent of like, what's the weather of like making small talk with small children. But what's also weird to me, maybe, I guess, I don't know, is that I can't remember any of my favorites growing up. I don't have a lot of favorites now, I don't think, or at least like I probably have extreme preferences in some cases that I'm not sort of like cognitively identifying as favorites. But there is Tina, who works at a design company that like shares space with us historically. She has 2 young boys, and one of them became like extremely obsessed with trains, like the subway system and trains and things like that. And she introduced me to this idea of like childhood obsessions, and what I think they call like extreme interest or intense interest, where like 1 in 3 kids, give or take, right? Again, scientific studies have to have some criticality, but around 1 in 3 kids develops an intense interest between the ages of 3 and 5, where they become like extremely sort of fixated on like one special thing. And that actually there are like some benefits that the scientists find from this. Like it sort of teaches like depth, persistence, like understanding like a broader view of things and whatever. But whenever I think about them, I always feel like I'm like left out of like the kids who are like obsessed with dinosaurs or vehicles or something. Like I missed a like life experience that I'm like not going to get because I wasn't sort of fixated or fascinated by something. Did you have things like that?
I definitely did. And they're weird. Well, they're not weird, but what's left behind, the detritus of those, to borrow a word of the day, is really present in little ways. So like I was obsessed with dinosaurs, and like, even when I was in New York, I had my velociraptors on the desk. Like, yes, it was because of Jurassic Park, so it's very connected, but it's also because of the same reason that, kids for generations are so fascinated by monsters that roamed the earth and all we can see are their bones left. But I remember I think through that just found a love of like language, or it sort of expressed itself really strongly because learning Diplodocus, like learning how to say Diplodocus, knowing what a Diplodocus was, and like just feeling so fucking cool that I would go around school and being like, "Oh yes, the long neck, that is a Diplodocus. It's in the water." Like,
it's not a Diplodocus, it's a Diplodocus.
It's a Diplodocus. That's what we talk. And I think that all these like animal names or all these dinosaur names are all like very see and say, but like it sort of like stuck with me really hard now because I think, as any listener to the podcast can attest, I have a weird vocabulary. I casually dropped obsequious in a conversation yesterday, and my husband stopped on the middle of the sidewalk and said, why would you, who does, I've never heard those sounds strung together. Why? And I think that I think that intense passion that I had for dinosaurs is something that totally got me interested in science because I wanted to be a chemist for a while. And then it just, I think, inspired a continual appreciation for like skepticism and searching for truth. Like I was always curious more than anything, maybe not skeptical. And so being curious about whys and understanding that like there's a why behind everything and that the why is always more gratifying than the thing itself. Um, is probably the thing that's actually shaped me most as an adult. And it shapes the way that I interact with people, with thoughts, with ideas. Um, but I think that also like there are certain favorites, for example, that were much simpler. I think that what I needed at that time was ways to define myself. And so I had favorites
Mm-hmm.
and I had hates. And I needed to have those things because I was like just a sentient blob of human matter, realizing that I need to like distinguish myself from other blobs of human matter that are in this classroom, all like interacting with each other. And feeling that sense of identity and feeling that sense
Mm-hmm.
of identity based on, you know, things that mattered to me, that were central to my interests. I think it was, I think it's powerful to encourage that in children. And I use powerful specifically because it can be detrimental. And I will really
Mm-hmm.
quickly, like, to the dog thing, like, I could have just continued to be afraid of dogs, and who knows how that was like making the situation worse. But there's so much that comes that I've learned from being able to take a step outside of those things that we define ourselves through, challenging those notions that we say are central to our identity, because what's on the other side, at the very most basic, is surprising. Hopefully it's
Mm-hmm.
great surprising. Other times it's like terrifying surprising and you're like, nah, I didn't, this was not for me. Me and horror movies, we don't get along, we won't get along. That's cool. Like, I dabbled in Get Out. I'll let, like, that's that, all right. Am I ever gonna watch Nightmare on Elm Street? Nah. Like, with just no, no,
Nope.
no, no, no. Not, mm-mm. Do I still hate the whole month of October because of Halloween? Most certainly do. I don't foresee that changing. But you know, I'll
You
keep.
like dressing up.
I like dressing up, but I don't like. Oh my God, do we need to do the Halloween episode all over again? Because I can bring them all out again. I know we've done this, but I do think that with those favorites too, so much of it says so much about us as children, but then we think about ourselves as we get older too, much older. Like when we think
Mm-hmm.
about our 60s, 70s, 80s, and we hear so much about how older folks hew toward conservatism, and they sort of go through a big life ebb and flow of being, and this is so generalizing, of course. We'll post some of the really reputable studies that reinforce this. But we tend to go from this state of defining ourselves, it seems, by these specific, you know, likes and dislikes, a huge crest for decades of exploration in many cases to broaden our horizons and sort of reshuffle what it means to be us. But then at some point we start to lock it down, and many people just start saying, I'm done. I'm done trying new things. I know what I like and I know what I don't like. Why would I waste my time like playing roulette? And
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that phenomenon scares me so much as it wildly perplexes me, given how far we sort of come from our childhood state of having these clear likes and dislikes to then exploring really interesting tastes and flavors that maybe we didn't know could surprise us.
Yeah, the identity formation part of it is really interesting because I think that is such a um, like a retroactive perception that I think adults have of children
Mm-hmm.
in those things, right? Like so much of your identity formation is happening when you're in your teens and sort of later stages of like cognitive development and understanding of yourself as like a distinct entity and of like societies and groups and things like that. And I do think it is why we sort of persist in asking children about their preferences as a means of trying to sort of understand or make predictions of like what type of person is this 3-year-old based on like what they tell me their favorite animal is or their favorite, whatever. And I think in the same way, the persistence is probably more telling than what someone actually likes potentially, right? Like that experience of like persistent preference then sort of forming an aspect of your identity is like, that is again like where that, like we've spoken, I don't know, a few episodes ago about sort of like being a joiner and community and things like that. And oftentimes I'm like, I just don't have a preference that is so persistent that then I feel like I can like internalize it as an aspect of my identity. And so that favorite part of it is interesting to me, where it's like, as adults, we're often viewing children through an adult lens. And in so many ways, that's good, of like interacting with them as an adult, but the sort of like identity projection and things like that we end up putting on childhood preference, the sort of telling ones are the ones now as an adult that you can talk about in retrospect that were persistent preferences that then became sort of like telling of understanding you as like a whole human, when you reach that like full identity formation and understanding yourself and your preferences and things like that. And so that it also just again still winds up making me feel like not fully formed or experienced person, because I have trouble finding those, like, I guess like the persistence is like always wanted to understand how things work, would like take things apart when I was little and
yes,
like study physiology, like books that my mom would have for like nurse training and stuff like that. I'd be like, this is where the heart is. Interesting. Like,
yes,
how does it work? Like trying to figure out how things work, I guess, is the persistent. So then I guess makes sense that I turned into a strategist at some point, right?
absolutely. I mean, I remember, I think that anyone who states that they are not a work in progress is just missing an opportunity. Like, we should all, I mean, I say this as someone who never saw myself as living in LA. Like, that was not on my life bingo card at all. And now I'm here, and it doesn't seem like I'm going anywhere anytime soon. But then I think the other thing too that comes to mind for like preference is as you start to realize how much preference is hard coded into you, versus preference is something that you sort of, face and dismiss. And I've been talking a lot about coming out and how like there's so much that I can map back to that moment. It's consequential for so many people, and it also doesn't ever stop. Like, you're constantly coming out. That's the thing that they never told us. But I think the idea in coming out that I still find so fascinating is that it is the first time that I and so many other queer people had to state a I'm gonna use the word preference, but I'm not gonna open up that debate because I disagree with preference. But that's a different thing. Coming out is about stating a preference that is against the norm or the stated norm, and that you are choosing to own. That you are saying, I'm saying this because this is who I am. It's a statement of totality. It's a statement of identity. It's a statement of being. It's an irrefutable truth. But it's also the most seismic moment where you have to say something that no one else could have well, in some cases they could have seen. But in many cases, you're putting it forth, and it's from within in every case. And being able to take that leap, and how in contrast that is to early childhood moments of Blue and pizza and dinosaurs. I think that's that, like, it's a revelatory moment, regardless of how it goes. And I think that that's why so many people over time can say things like it gets better and can have a sort of an appreciation for that, because taking that leap for yourself is the most pure version of putting yourself first that ever will happen for you. And that's amazing.
Well, Aaron, as much as I say I don't have favorites, I can say that you're my favorite. That I know.
Sorry. It's too much. It's too much. I'm sorry. Okay, my Kleenex is done. Ooh.
Do you now want the burden of Justice wrap-up corner?
Oh God. Yeah, let me see if I can do it as quickly as possible.
We have favorites. Goodbye.
We started with the question of what do our favorites say about our adult selves, essentially. And I think what we've surmised or floated around is the fact that they're only valuable when we're adults. They're only valuable as artifacts for us to chart our own stories of why. And the fact that we all have stories of why is one of the joys of life that we should always lean into, never run away from, and embrace dearly, because the opportunities are fantastic on the other side.
Just dance like no one's watching.
Yes!
Just be a Pinterest board, okay? Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by the lemon tree that I'm staring at out of my window.
As always, we want to thank executive producer Jess Vander. Even though she's not here, she can still be our spirit totem.
You know what? And thank you to my favorite sound engineer on this podcast, Alex Contel.
And we would be remiss in not expressing our extreme gratitude for programming coordinator and DJ Lil Tiger, Les Jacobs.
And if we are not familiar with the truth of this podcast, the heart of it, the center, the truth, the research engine, sort of the podcast, Sarah Gilbert and Nora Mestridge, thank you for everything that you do every time. And your lovely cover art.
And as always, thank you, Sorry, Ellen.
Thank you. Sorry.
Special thanks. Taking apart RC cars as a child, and my parents either not finding me or not caring that I was playing with a lot of electricity and power tools when I was a child. I think it was probably more of like, he's not screaming in pain. We're just going to keep doing whatever it was that we're doing. He hasn't injured himself yet.
I want to thank the book, The Way Things Work by David Macaulay, which was my favorite book on our family bookshelf that had like exploded views of machines. And I would look at like cruise ships and they would have these amazing like 5-page pullouts of every individual part of like a tractor, a boat, a car, and you'd see all the pieces. I loved that book. So thank you for making that. And I'm so glad that it's on Amazon right now.
I would like to thank the book Goblins in the Castle that I did have a preference for at some point, like 3rd grade, maybe. I haven't thought of that book in a very long time, but hopefully it holds up. Maybe I'll go back and reread Goblins in the Castle.
I mean, now that we're in book territory, I feel like favorite books were a big thing for me. So I have to thank The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Twisted Fairy Tales, because that is still my favorite childhood book. That book and those stories are amazing. So unexpected, and also the template for all the comedy that I like now, which is weird. I have to thank the Boxcar Children, because yes, I read every one of those books.
Boxcar Children, yep.
Amazing. Goosebumps, well done. Critical hit, love it. Animorphs.
Sideways stories from Wayside School.
Oh, right, man. And like Judy Blume, like There's some good Scholastic, all right.
Fudge.
Y'all did some things.
Super Fudge.
Super Fudge.
Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing.
Oh, I guess then I have to unthank, I suppose, chocolate. I think everybody knows that I don't like chocolate, and that has been hard-coded in me since I was a kid. So I'm Team Vanilla all the way.
It doesn't take consumer research to know that Aaron doesn't like chocolate.
It is the truth. We have verified. Well, Joey, you're my favorite as well. My favorite. And it's really nice to see you today. I hope you have a good day, friend.
Love you, mean it. Bye.
Bye. I don't know why I turned into like a country singer for a minute. Like
Triple D
at the taco. Not taco.
I was thinking D3 Knuckle Puck.
Yes. It's Knuckle Puck time. That was really good.
The Knuckle Puck.
That is not a good movie.